The goal of our first week in Biology 101 is to learn what the field of biology encompasses and how we study biology. So I find that my students usually know what biology is. They know that it is a study of living organisms. They know that it is a study of how organisms work. They usually have an idea of the various fields of biology. And most students have some experience with biology. Not all of them, but most students have encountered biology in high school or maybe junior high or maybe just learning after high school. So our goal in Biology 101 is to learn about the living world. Now that's a really, really broad goal because the field of biology encompasses many, many things. It encompasses anatomy and physiology and health, evolution, the study of genetics and passing on traits, and the genetics of disease and passing on characteristics. It encompasses ecology and how humans and other living organisms interact with their environment. And usually students have an idea of what they're going to learn when they come in to Biology 101. And they're usually shocked to find out that we are going to spend most of Biology 101 at the cellular level. Now, that's not to say that those other things are not important, but we have to start at the cell in order to get to those other things. And that's because living organisms can be reduced down to a cell. And our most basic definition of a living organism is that a living organism is made up of one or more cells. So an organism that is made up of only one cell is just as alive as a human or a dog or an oak tree. An organism that has one cell or a trillion cells is still performing all of the same functions for life. And so we can study the cell in order to help us learn about all of those other functions, about anatomy and physiology, about genetics, about ecology, about evolution. Everything that we are going to learn in any biology field starts with the cell. So we are going to start at that level. We're going to talk about what makes something living and non-living. And as we go through the semester, we're going to look at the functions of a cell that allow it to interact with its environment, to perform metabolic processes, to interact with other cells within a living organism. And so we're going to start learning about this by learning about how living organisms are organized and how we grow in complexity. And then later in the semester, we're going to learn about the cell and all of those specific functions that allow the cell to be alive. So we can study living organisms at different levels. And the level we study them at depends on what we are interested in. But our study of biology is rooted in chemistry. And I've noticed that many of my students have an allergy to chemistry. I happen to love it. Some students have taken chemistry. Some students plan to never take chemistry. But we have to understand some chemistry in order to understand biology. So our lowest level of biology is going to be atoms and molecules, because atoms and molecules come together to form the components of our living cells. And then our cells come together to form our tissues in a living organism. Humans have tissues, plants have tissues, fungus have tissues. All of these more complex organisms are organized as a collection of cells, and those cells are made up of atoms and molecules. And so to understand how a cell works, we have to understand how our atoms and molecules come together. In order to understand how our tissues work, like our muscle tissues, we have to understand how cells function. And this organization can move all the way up. If we want to understand how our organs function, we have to understand how the cells and tissues that make them up function. So Biology 101 is mostly going to focus on these three lower levels here: atoms, molecules, and cells. If you go on to Biology 102, you'll get into organismal biology, some physiology, and then moving up to ecology and how organisms interact with one another. So most of our semester is going to be focused in a little bit of chemistry, but a lot of cellular function. So we are going to talk about cellular metabolism, or the chemical reactions that help our cells to run. We're going to talk about our genetic material and how that is passed on to the next generation. And then we're going to talk about how that genetic material impacts evolution and how organisms can change over time, how they can respond to changes in their environment based on their genetic makeup. So biologists study all of these levels. We can't study everything in all of these levels, because even if you take the entire Biology 101 and 102 series, you can't get everything in those 32 weeks. But our goal is to introduce you to these most important topics. Because of that, we are going to study biology from a reductionist or a reductionism perspective. Reductionism is looking at the smallest parts in order to help us understand the whole system. So we are going to be looking at biochemical processes. We are going to be looking at cellular processes. We are going to be looking at molecular processes. And we do this because each of those areas is going to contribute to the whole organism. And we like to think of this as a bottoms-up approach. If you want to understand how an engine works, you need to understand how all of the parts of that engine work. If you want to understand how an organism functions, you need to understand how all of those parts work together to function. And so we are going to be looking at the cellular level. We are going to be looking at the simplest parts in order to help us understand living organisms and their complexity. We can also study biology sort of from the opposite direction. And this is where we look at organisms as a whole and how all of their different parts come together and interact to produce this complex living system. Now, reductionism and systems biology are not adversaries. They can absolutely work together. And the reason is that sometimes reductionism doesn't completely give you the whole picture. Because if you look at the cellular level, you may not be looking at how those cells are interacting. You may not be looking at how tissues are interacting. And so looking at biology from both directions, from the bottom up and from the top down, we can get a bigger picture of how an organism works altogether. So we focus on the parts with the goal of being able to look at an entire system, and with the goal of having an understanding of those parts so that we can understand how the system works altogether. So we are going to learn some of the basic organizational features of living organisms. One of the most important things when we are using reductionism is the idea of emergent properties. So emergent properties are new properties that arise as a system becomes more organized. So for example, I have this image of a bicycle here. And we have all the wheels, we have the chain, we have the frame. And if they're in a pile on your garage floor, they're not very helpful. Each one gives its own part of the full structure. So you might know that those wheels roll. You might know that the chain controls the wheel, but it doesn't control the wheel until you get them all together on the frame. And so while each piece has its own function, we don't get a new property until we organize them in a specific manner. And biology works the same way. We organize our molecules into our cells. We organize our cells into our tissues. And at each level of organization, we get a new function. A muscle cell by itself doesn't do anything, but a whole bunch of muscle cells together helps an individual walk or run or pick up their pencil. Another example is photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is a really complicated process that is the basis of bringing energy into all living systems. And I'm going to switch over here. This is a slightly different slide, but it shows we've got our structure within the cell, the chloroplast, that has a particular structure and function. And when those chloroplasts are organized together into a structure, when chlorophyll molecules are organized into a chloroplast, we get this new property of photosynthesis. And when we get a whole bunch of cells that perform photosynthesis, we get this organism that can bring in energy from the sun and trap it for all living organisms later on. The chlorophyll molecule and the chloroplast within plant cells are also a great example of structure and function in biology. As organisms become more complex, their structures are going to dictate the function that they can perform. So this is intimately tied with emergent properties. As you get new structures that are combined with the old structures or with other structures in an organism, you're going to get new functions. So as we organize these chlorophyll molecules in a specific way, in a specific structure within our cells, we're going to get this new function, this function of photosynthesis. Now, we can also look at structure and function sort of removed from emergent properties, not entirely, but to look at a couple of examples. So a hummingbird wing is super cool because it rotates in a figure 8 shape. And if you were able to watch a hummingbird flap its wings, its shoulder moves in this figure 8. And that allows this cool little hummingbird to hover. So the structure of that shoulder allows this really unique function of flight and hovering. Another example are the hummingbird beaks. You'll notice that those beaks are real long and thin. Excuse my terrible drawing. They have evolved alongside flowers for the specific purpose of reaching down these flowers and pulling out nectar. So this long, thin structure gives us this very specific function of being able to get nectar deep from within that flower. So we're going to see this idea of emergent properties and structure and function many, many times through this semester. We're going to see how those unique properties, those unique functions unique structures come together to give these cool new properties and functions.